Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of INCON. Funnily enough, we were just discussing with our guest, the Ungoogleable Michaelangelo, as to what INCON stood for, because he obviously thought it was something incredibly clever and esoteric, where it just means in conversation. But he did point out as well that actually it sounds a little bit like Archon. So maybe that's why we attract the little blighters, because they realize that we're mimicking them and we're marketing them for themselves. Right, everybody, welcome again. Many of you will have known that over 1,200 of you have already watched our previous discussion with the great Ungoogleable Michaelangelo, and it went down so profoundly well. And the three of us, myself, Sarah, and Michaelangelo as well, really thoroughly enjoyed the last discussion, to such an extent we decided that we would go for a full 2 hours now and just really dig into a lot of the things we discussed earlier on in last week. So that's what we're about to do. If anybody gets the opportunity, please do check the original recording to get some ideas and some of the things we're discussing. Ungoogleable has now moved, and he's no longer down in Mexico and is over there in Miami, looking very, very healthy and very, very sunny. I think. What's the temperatures like there, by the way? Is it pretty extraordinary?
It's getting up near the 100s in the Fahrenheit. I don't know if do you do Fahrenheit in England, or
We
are
used
you a
to, yeah,
Celsius?
yeah. So I grew up with
Switch it up.
Fahrenheit.
Yeah, I grew up
Yeah.
with Celsius, but I've gone
In
accustomed
fact,
to
funnily enough,
Fahrenheit. Yeah.
as an in-joke, one of the previous guests on this show who might be listening to this or watching is a guy called Charlie Farron, who used to play with the Joe Perry Project. He's America's favorite support act. And his band was called Fahrenheit. It's a pun on Farron. So
Gotcha.
the Fahrenheit is obviously a theme we've discussed. I mean, I grew up with Fahrenheit, and I still find converting backwards and forwards. I still 84 to me is hot, whereas I still find 30 quite cold, really, even though it's
Well,
not
then the simple answer is it's hot over here, but thank goodness there's AC, which is a luxury I did not have in the jungle. So right now I am very happy camper.
Absolutely good. That sounds very, very good. It looks a very different environment. I notice you've got some of your paintings on the wall as well, which is good.
True. There's even walls here and everything. It's
wow. God, you got a roof. Have you got a roof as well?
I got a roof. We can flush toilet paper. It's a whole new world, man.
Jeez. Well, if you come over to Greece, you probably have to get used to the toilet paper thing. Although, Sarah, I think they've cured that in Athens, haven't they? So it's maybe not too bad anymore. Right. Okay. Well, what we decided to do, wouldn't we, that you were going to do one of your special monologues at the start, and your monologues are extraordinary. So I'm really looking forward to this. So if you want to share it with everybody and blow their minds, as it were.
Let's see if I can pull this up. So yeah, I figured it would be a good idea just to kind of like recap the main theme that we put forth in the last installment through this little 1.5 minute illustrative clip. So let me pull that up right here. So the theme here, oh, look, it didn't show up here. 1 second here. The theme here, as I put it forth, is pareidolia as a daemonic interface. So just so that everybody can keep up, the word pareidolia basically just means perceiving random data and then perceiving from that a meaningful pattern. So that's like faces in the clouds or Jesus on toast. And that can also extend into conspiracy theory territories, where you just start connecting so many dots that you think the pattern you see is what's out there. And that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate through this little presentation here, is that there is a processing within the brain that takes place before anything else. So here we go. Enjoy. Can we see the screen? Is it already?
We can, yeah. That's good.
Great. Here we go. So there we have it. There's our main thesis.
Because just we had a long discussion about this, and it is intriguing in that I'd never really thought about pareidolia other than people seeing things where there isn't anything. And I'd never really realized before that, in fact, probably hypnagogic imagery is the same kind of thing, and various other areas. And there are a number of friends of mine who are artists who paint using pareidolia images, and I always thought it was almost wishful thinking, but I think there's more to it than this. I suppose it's almost like a Rorschach, isn't it?
That's exactly right.
What we see in many ways. I mean, Sarah, what are your thoughts on it so far on terms of this?
I saw a naked woman with long black hair getting out of the bath.
When?
Just then. on the image that you posted before you painted your characters over it. It just saw it really clearly.
Oh, that's an interesting one. That's an interesting one as to we all see things differently, but it's, as we were saying last time, it's very much the way in which we perceive reality anyway, isn't it? You know, we have all our expectations as to what things are going to be, and we see things in certain ways. I mean, I'm reminded of the Kate Bush song, and I can't remember which one it is, but I think it's off the album The Dreaming. And then she said, "Oh, look, there's a cloud over there. It looks like Ireland."
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
And of course the Joni Mitchell song Clouds. I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow it's life delusions, illusions. I've really can't clouds again. Was that Joni Mitchell, or was it a cover of a song by somebody else? I can't remember. But yeah. So how did you get into all this then? What was your background to all this?
I think it's always been, I mean, as children, we're very open to this kind of thing. You know, we see faces in the clouds and that sort of thing. My mother used to make faces in my yogurt in the morning. She would like arrange various food objects so that in effect, I won't eat anything without a face. And then, you know, like, it's just, I've just always been open to this kind of imaginative thing. And over time, as I started becoming an artist or identifying as an artist and creating, there was an element of this in there, but over the years it has become more prominent, and I've embraced that far more. And there's a quality to the art, I think, that's like almost like ghost busting, where there's something that arises and you trap it, you capture it. Because you know, we see these faces, and the question is always like, well, why are they the way they are? Why do they look so distinct? You know, like, is this just if this is just randomly prompted? And in some sense it is, but there's also a kind of a magnetic attraction there, which is also the nature of the Rorschach, I think, is that it pulls something to the forefront that's actually coming from the background. And this is why I consider pareidolia a daemonic interface, because the daemon, as you very well know, as you wrote a book called The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, the daemon is, in a way, our representative of the unconscious, of the deeper submerged parts of ourselves, perhaps even the parts of ourselves that are extended throughout time, that are not concentrated in these space-time coordinates, but that bleed out into the larger biography of our lives. So to have this kind of a representative or consultant, if you will, to guide your perception in such a way where it prompts the deeper processes of ourselves and of our fragmented selves, our fragmented psyches, the disowned parts of ourselves, because we very carefully, and also this is an unconscious and automatic process, very carefully curate our personality or curate our self-identification. And there are very many parts of ourselves that color outside those lines unless we integrate them. And I find that this process, through art or just generally through pareidolia, for being able to see these different faces and face them, because oftentimes they can be scary things, they can be very weird or perverted images. It reveals things about ourselves that sometimes we're not willing or able to access, and it gives us the opportunity to kind of reconcile those relationships with ourselves, or with ourselves with capital S, the larger self. And so for me, I think of the process by which this happens also in relation to something called EVP, which is electronic voice phenomena. This is a process that mediums would use to, quote unquote, communicate with the dead. through a radio, where you tune the radio to the frequency of white noise. And within that shushing static, you start to hear the shapes of sounds, and people start interpreting in like an audio Rorschach fashion, start interpreting answers and voices, which can then be interpreted as the voices of the dead, you know, your grandmother or John Lennon. John Lennon is easier to reach through a radio, of course. And then through that, you start to, basically, you pull these things to the forefront. And I look at nature as a pareidolia generator in that sense, because there is so much aleatoric organization, so much chance-based organization, an algorithm of randomness within the elemental surface of nature. Like if you look at the ground, at the sand is itself a kind of white noise. If you look at the clouds, there's this elemental random organization that, because we're made of these elements, there's a magnetic conversation that takes place that starts shaping these things. And so I've considered that notion also EVP, but that's elemental visual phenomena, which is just another way of speaking to this idea of pareidolia. And if I can, for a moment, and we can talk over this too, but I'm going to show you a couple of these pictures that actually take natural processes. I call them grotesque.
Spotting. I like that, stain spotting. That's a very good pun.
Stain spotting is that's what I call it. The video that I showed you, where it's literally street stains outlined in chalk or outlined in lines. But these are considered grotesque gods, and they are, for instance, there's a funny one. This is the trail of the tropical trolls. As you can see here, it's a tree that becomes an embodiment of something. We've got here a sad palm tree. So I just like very minorly embellished these images to bring them out. This is a funny one. Ron Perlman, the actor, I discovered him in a rock surface in Xilitla, Mexico, and I saw it, and then I made some minor adjustments to bring it out, and I was like, I got to find a picture of him to like show the uncanny likeness, and I found this picture that was like, it's almost like what I found and what I crafted was a precognition of the image that I would encounter that would go with it. It was really like a bizarre thing.
Hellboy in the rocks.
Yeah, Hellboy in the rocks. Rock Perlman. This is a very recent one here that I call Wicked Witchy Wicker, which is a material that a lot of things in Mexico are made out of. And I saw this wicker basket, and it just immediately, I was like, it gave me the feeling that the kind of the witchy landscape in Mexico conveys to me, this sorcerous Castanadian quality. And so I decided to bring that out in this shape so that other people could see it too. So that's my rant, and I'll let you bounce off.
You made a very interesting point there. There's two things. I've written about EVP in the past. And when I wrote a book with Irving Laszlo, and I did a whole chapter on EVP and came across some quite interesting things. But before then, I'd like to just bounce back a little bit, because your observation about the daemon and pareidolia is quite interesting, because it reminds me of the way in which when the British term for déjà vu was called paramnesia. And before they used the French term, I think it was Emile Boriac that actually came up with the term déjà vu originally. But the idea of paramnesia is, again, the recognition of something in your past that you can't identify properly. So it's a kind of a set of circumstances that triggers an emotion or triggers a recognition in your mind. And of course, the standard definition of the déjà vu phenomenon was coined by a guy called Vernon Neppe, who is a psychiatrist at, I think he's at Seaview. He's based in Seattle anyway. And to paraphrase his definition, it's the subconscious remembrance of something that has happened sometime in an undescribed past. And I was thinking, this is really quite interesting, and you've hit on something really quite interesting here. Is that, of course, I would argue that a déjà vu sensation is stimulated by demonic memory, that you're remembering a set of circumstances that you have had and experienced in your past when you were another Eidolon. which your daemon remembers, because your daemon is always the continuity of your consciousness. But the daemons, the demonic leaks into the eidolonic, and suddenly then there's this recognition that you don't know, it's subliminal because you're an eidolon and you don't really make the recognition, but it kind of filters across the corpus callosum and you go, I've seen this somewhere before. And then we fill in the details in exactly the same way that you're filling in the details in terms of pareidolia. So there's something here, I think, that could be really interesting to pursue in terms of ideas, you know. And going back to the EVP, I mean, I can't remember her name now. There's an Italian researcher that who sent me some material that she'd been working on for many years. And again, it's something I'd never really thought of before. I'd only ever thought, you know, it's just people hearing things that aren't there. But there's more to it than that. It's part of the embroidering of the environment, isn't it, that we perceive?
There's this strange notion that is almost universally culturally
Cardoza,
sanctioned.
by the way, the lady's called Cardoza, the lady I was dealing with.
There's this strange notion that's almost universally sanctioned, which is the idea that there are thoughts or perceptions that can be dismissed, that are not important in the weaving of the tapestry of one's life. And I find these the most interesting. This is why the idea of exploring the limits of language and where they meet the fringes of reality is that the creation is unfinished. It is open-ended. And the parts that are unfinished, where it is crudely rendered, such as elemental realities, where there is a kind of randomness, there is a compensation in the brain that takes place. I call this the language of loss. It happens, for instance, if you lose certain frequencies in your hearing when ear cells die, the brain compensates through tinnitus. It's like, oh, there's a frequency missing. Let me make up for that. Shh, you know, like there's the compensations that take place. It's similarly, if you go through a breakup or a loved one dies, their absence fills with the presence of their memory. And there's this constant like compensation for things, for missing dimensions. And pareidolia is a similar supplement in that sense. So there are these blind spots or these blank spots in reality's design that prompt to the surface these images, and people will largely either it remains subconscious, you see it, but you don't acknowledge it, you don't engage with it, and so it just streams past. But I don't think there is such a thing as a thought that can be dismissed. If you're an existential investigator, if you're somebody that's navigating through life, it's good to look at every little bit, because every little bit can be a piece of guidance. It could be your longer self stretched through time, your daemon articulating to you, communicating to you through these things, through these kind of synchronistic winks or deja vus, these moments of remembrance that call you into the present in order to better navigate your way through, you know, where the present is the pre-sent to where the pre-sent is sending you.
Yeah, it's funny, actually. We've had a comment from in the chat box from somebody called Thought Crime. His initial reaction was utter dross, guys, which to a certain extent is an interesting point. But he then puts a caveat on that and said it's just the mind finding familiar patterns that along with an active imagination and delusions of grandeur. I can see his point on that. I'm not, you know, but I think what we're trying to do here, Thought Crime, is to just spin out some ideas in terms of this, because art form and art has been part of art since Lascaux and onwards. You know, artists have always used the imagination and embroidering things, and what we're doing is we're discussing that now. But I think, you know, your point is not an invalid one, but I think that we're trying to dig a little bit deeper here in terms of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, reality life can be a bread sandwich. You don't have to put anything on it. I like to put a spread of imagination on it. It makes my life more flavorful, more interesting for me. Some people, they don't have that. They can look at things and they like it just the way it is. You don't have to put more thought into it. You don't have to engage with it. For me, the more I engage with it, the more I get out of it, the more it teaches me about myself and the world. But that's just me. That's a personal preference.
Well, I think it's the understanding of how quantum mechanics works, you know, and the idea that there is a direct relationship between the observer or the measurer and reality itself. And we discussed this last time, with a concept called the collapse of the wave function, that effectively a subatomic particle, until it is observed and measured, is a statistical wave function that could be located anywhere in the universe. And the act of observation, and there is a direct relationship between the act of observation or the act of measurement and the subatomic particle and the wave function collapsing, which means we are to a degree co-creating our reality. So if our anticipations can create these things, it's a valid area to discuss, and we're doing the science here. It's not as if we are just being very esoteric in this discussion. What we're saying is more and more science is discovering that this is how nature works, that there is a symbiotic relationship between the observer and the observed and the reality around us. And if that is the case, then we see patterns, and we see patterns everywhere. I mean, one of the things that I discussed many years ago was the 1111 phenomenon. And I was noticing 1111 everywhere. Now, as my analytical mind and my reductionist mind came to the conclusion, the reason why people see 1111 is because when we were evolving on the plains of Africa, we were animals that had to look for predators or for food. So therefore we would be attuned to look for anything that's standing vertical from the plane. So therefore, because it could be a potential predator. So when you see a sequence of numbers, the only numbers that go straight up are ones. The other ones are shaped in different ways. So we will zoom in, and attention bias will make us see the 1111. And I thought for a long time this was what was going on, until my wife pointed out something peculiar when she turned around and she said, "You've been missing the most obvious 1111 phenomenon of all the things you're talking about." And as I mentioned to you, she's incredibly practical, but she was the one that pointed this out. And she said, it's the title of the Dutch edition, and you'll know this as somebody who's Dutch, but the Dutch edition of my book, published by INCON, the first book is Their Life After Death, was called 111111, which means life after life after life in Dutch.
In writing, it looks like in Dutch it would be pronounced leven na leven na leven, but still it comes down to the same thing, and it's a very funny play, and it's a very astute observation about the evolutionary hardwiring for these kinds of perceptions, because I think pareidolia is a vestige of a similar thing, where we're scanning the landscape for faces, for the faces of predators and things like that, or trying to recognize faces in the brush. And then sometimes maybe you start seeing faces where they are not. And so you try to reel that in. But as now we're in a much more progressed, civilized state where we don't have to keep our eyes out for predators all the time, the clenched fist of our consciousness gets to unfold and become play. So now our fears and our defenses and our anticipations of dangers become our allies and become something that we get to play with. And my earliest art explorations, in a sense, were when I was a child in the dark. I was often visited by wolves and bats. They would gather, their faces would gather from the dark, almost like comets streaking towards me and moving through me and just sending chills down my spine. The wolf face was almost like a Lon Chaney wolf man with the two little fangs poking up. And the bats were just gnarly, and they all had fangs, and it was terrifying. And I would tell my mother about this.
I used to see a wolf at my bedroom door when I was a kid as well, just to kind of suspended in midair, wolf face peering around the door. I don't remember being very scared of it. I remember kind of liking it. Maybe it was because I had a cabin bed and I didn't feel like it was going to jump up and get me on the cabin bed.
I think that the wolf archetype might be like an archetype of fear that is just like so ingrained in the child. I mean, we get the story of the big bad wolf and all this kind of stuff. I had a long-haired Alsatian when I was a kid as well, and that's quite a wolf-like dog. So I wonder whether I didn't feel like it was a long-haired Alsatian. It definitely did felt like a dog, but the face of that dog is very much kind of like burned into my consciousness. Like I can conjure it up so vividly because I spent so much time looking at my dog that I've really kind of
strengthened that memory so much. But I wanted to mention.
Let me finish the story real quick, because so I told my mother about these wolves and bats that haunted me in the dark, and she came up with this ingenious idea to draw them. I think she'd seen it in a children's book somewhere, to draw them and tie them to balloons and send them off. So I drew very crude renditions of my tormentors, tied them to strings, tied them to balloons. We went to a nearby park and we released them, but they weren't helium balloons, so it was anticlimactic. They just kind of like dragged through the gravel when a gust of wind would come by. And then we hid behind a little wall and watched as these two girls, these teenage girls on bicycles, arrived and started inspecting the drawings. And my mother turned to me and she said, "See, now they'll get them," which was a very almost like psychomagical, witchy notion. It's like, just pass it on, someone else will take care of it. And I didn't understand the morality of it. I thought, no wolves and bats tonight, sounds great to me. But then later that night, some friends of my sister came by and they brought gifts for her little brother. They brought some balloons with drawings of wolves and bats on them. So from that moment on, there's this sense of allying my fear, of like accepting the shadow matter of my own psyche. So that's very much like ingrained in the way that I look at these pareidolik things as well. Like they're random imagery that comes up, but you can look into them and you get to see a mirror of your deeper processes, and you can turn away from it if there's something scary or unpleasant. You can laugh at it if there's something funny. You can interact with it, and it's a way of multiplying yourself. Similarly to, like, it's almost like a Vedantic idea, right? That the universe is this one entity, this what I call DID deity, like a deity with dissociative identity disorder that splits itself into multiple parts in order to have a better time.
DID entity, that is superb. It's better than my Godemon, I think. It's your version of the Orain Sof, because I have the term the Godemon. And the Godemon is my variation on the singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. But in fact, I like yours better. I think that again has a wonderful pun. Sarah, you were going to make a point before as well. You were going to carry on.
Well, I was just going to say about your mum's tip for the drawing those wolves and bats is very sort of an Egyptian idea. This idea that if you wanted to protect people in tombs, you'd put these demons with visual kind of chaining them, or knives stabbing them, to sort of show that they couldn't reach the people in these tombs or in these areas. So I like that idea. It's very much a sort of like magical conjuring through art. But I mean, a lot of what we've been talking about, to me, kind of goes back to this idea of the oracular that we discussed last week. And I was interested in what you were saying about EVP, and it got me thinking about this idea of deep listening, like ancient ideas of deep listening, where people are actually trying to listen to the sound of the universe and purposefully lying in caves to hear the kind of language of the earth and the language of the cosmos. And I think that this was something that, maybe pareidolia was just more of a perceptual reality for ancient people as well, because I'm thinking about viewing nature spirits and viewing gods and goblins and demons. This is something that sort of naturally would be conjured up if people had a more sort of pareidolik type consciousness. And that kind of gets me onto Julian Jaynes as well, and his idea of bicameralism. And he was claiming that schizophrenia was the hangover of bicameralism, and pareidolia is a feature of a schizophrenia and psychosis. So perhaps that would hint at people having more sort of pareidolia in ancient times, and that's how they were able to invest the natural world with these kind of visual complex entities. Because I do think there's an element in modern consciousness whereby we don't have that great sense of mystery that ancient people had, where we think we have all the answers to everything. We think we know what every single species on Earth looks like. We think we know what every country looks like. We've seen photographs that come from deep space. There's no great mystery anymore. I always like that idea of adventurers embarking upon long sea voyages and never knowing what kind of like wild, fantastical creatures they might encounter. And then even when they wash up on the shores of, say, America, drawing animals that no one's ever seen before in the West, and then being kind of fantastical representations, because through that lens of seeing something fantastical and exotic for the first time, it looks entirely different. It's not just taken at face value, it's imbued with this magical essence and this mystery and this excitement that it's hard for us to actually understand, this witnessing of something for the first time ever, which I just think people don't generally have as adults these days. You know, children still have that sense of mystery and wonder and magic because everything's still new and mysterious to them. But for most adults, I think there's an assumption that they've seen and know everything. You know, not to say they have all the wisdom in the world, but that they think that everything is knowable and understandable.
Well, it's one of the things I came across recently, and I thought it was quite interesting, was the startle factor, the way in which the vast majority of human beings get startled. If they see something they're unsure of, or it's in their periphery vision, we jump. And it was arguing that that's an evolutionary thing, because effectively the people who had the startle factor would survive predators. Because if you jumped at everything, there was a chance that one of the things you jumped because you were nervous about could have been a predator and you would have survived. Whereas somebody who didn't have the startle factor would never be startled by anything, would amble into a lion and not jump and be killed. So there is this idea, isn't there, of sometimes just noticing things and fearing them because they look dangerous is a survival factor. And of course, we know that children are programmed. Anything that looks like a face, you know, with two big eyes, is something we're going to find attractive and interesting. And of course, this is how cartoons work, with large eyes and everything else as well. But somebody in the chat room, Thy Hand Revolve, has made a comment about, and I'm quite with this person. It said, it's interesting we haven't discussed, or whether we have discussed, the artist Oscar Osman Spar. And of course, I don't know if you know Osman Spar, but I remember one of the main reasons I got into, and again, it's interesting, the rats and everything else, and the bats and everything that you were talking about, Michelangelo, is that the reason I got into my whole interest in the whole subject of hallucinations and the world, the liminal world that seems to bleed into this one, was when I was 12, I had double pneumonia. And my mother, being a nurse, she nursed me from home. But I went through the crisis of pneumonia over a period of 2 nights. And I was hallucinating crazily, and I was seeing rats climbing up the walls and everything else as well. And when I recovered from it, the whole thing intrigued me so much, the idea of how my brain was able to extract or extrapolate things from my subconscious that I wasn't anticipating, and then projecting them out into 3-dimensional space. Now, the funny thing is that around about 18 months later, I started collecting a part work called Man, Myth and Magic, which in the mid-1960s was quite a popular part work for budding people who were interested in anthropology and everything else. And again, Thy Hand Revolve, you'll find this interesting, was one of the major articles that particularly affected me was an article on Oscar Osman Spar, I think, or was it Austin or Osman Spar? But it was about his pictures. And again, his pictures were very atavistic. They were kind of like alien creatures who looked really terrifying, beings that were coming out of the mists of time being pulled through. Now, of course, if my egregorial model is correct, and the idea that these entities in some way we co-create, but they have independence of us. This is the imagery we're talking about here, isn't it? You know, these are the elementals that we see around us, the elementals that our ancestors saw. You know, these are things that people live with. It's just we live now in boxes, don't we? We live in houses. We don't ever sit outside in the middle of the night and hear rustling sounds around us. But of course, this is what ghosts are all about. This is what so many things are about. And to just dismiss them, they're an experience.
This is why I think this mode of perception and line of thought was so amplified while I was living in the jungle, because a lot of, the houses, the cabins, I lived at first in a snail-shaped house, so a spiral-shaped house, and all the walls, it's a round, round walls made out of rocks, and the rock faces will speak to me. Literally, rock faces is what we call them, right? And, of course, the sound of the jungle permeates through the space. As Sarah brought up in the last conversation, that creates a kind of like synesthetic overflow. And like I found it really interesting, Sarah, when you're talking about, people going into caves intentionally back in the old days, almost like a sensory deprivation chamber in order to better tune in to the rumblings of their own body and the larger cosmos at large. And what happens in those spaces is you, again, become very attuned to the kind of ambient sensations, ambient frequencies, which then in this EVP sense start to speak. And then you can, of course, you can discard this as like, yeah, what you hear is nothing. You're just hearing patterns in there. But what are the patterns saying? There is too much emphasis. I just made a post about this regarding the psychedelic renaissance, this rise of psychedelic science. There's too much emphasis these days on the how of it and not on the what of it. There's too much looking at how the radio works and not enough listening to the music or discussing the broadcasts. And this is a critique I've had on, and psychedelia is a metaphor in this sense, just for exploring the mind. Psychonautics, sailing of the soul, has really nothing to do with substances. It has to do with how the techniques in which we engage with the mind. And one critique that I've had on the psychedelic state for a long time is that people come out of it and they'll describe their hallucinations as, fractals or swirlies or visuals. But what were they saying? I see this as a custom language curated by your unconscious, a cellular language custom curated for you and clothed with your perceptions that's trying to communicate something deep to you, to get you back in your body and back in the wholeness of your own being. And so I find there is an importance, and again, for me, it's a personal preference to engage with these things. Like Sarah brought up the old ways of seeing and spirit animals and spirits in the forest. These are animistic apprehensions, and I think pareidolia does play into that. And the Janesian idea, because Julian Jaynes put forth this idea.
Can you guys, both of you, just for the audience, there'll be people out there who will have heard of Julian Jaynes, but the people that won't. I mean, maybe you start with it, Michelangelo, and then Sarah, you add your bit as well. And if there's anything I'd want to add, I'll come in later. But just let everybody know who was Julian Jaynes and what was it all about.
So Julian Jaynes was a Princeton psychologist and a philosopher who wrote a book called The Origins of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. It's a headful. The first 60 pages or so, he spends his time very narrowly and succinctly defining what he means by consciousness. And nowadays, the word consciousness, it's a very meandering, broad, vast term that applies to all kinds of different things, but it's not as dialed in as what he came down to. And first, he, just like Michelangelo chipping away at the block to show you the image hidden within it, he chips away at what it's not. And what it finally distills down to, and I'm going to put this in a very simplified way, is I did a whole episode on this with Marcel Kousten, who is the founder of the Julian Jaynes Societies. For anybody interested in that, I'll link that in the comments later on. Basically, what he defines it as is subjective interiority that is introspectable. And he describes it as a metaphor-generated model of the world. What he is ultimately proposing is that as language evolved, as metaphors for the physical behavioral world evolved, metaphors have a creative potential. And what happened is that the metaphors for the physical world created a mind space, a space within our mind, which is not actually in our heads, but that's where we project it. So if I look you in the eyes, I'm going to project the same interior space that I have behind my eyes, in which I get to next think of where I've been. Basically, a metaphor-generated model of the world in which there is even a little avatar, which he calls the analog I, or the metaphor me, which is not you, but it is the you that does the thinking, that moves thoughts around as if they were objects. And he proposed that the crowning achievement of consciousness, of our sovereign selves, in a way, is something that evolved from an earlier mentality, which he calls the bicameral mind. Bicameral just means two-chambered. So it's really the bicameral brain. So the corpus callosum splits the brain in two, and one side of the brain lords over the person, which is a man of action or a woman of action in the old days, until about 3,000 years ago is what he's speculating. And the other side generates auditory hallucinations, often clad in the guise of a god or an overseer or a parent or a familiar person a little upper in the hierarchies. And these hallucinated hierarchies, these hallucinated gods at critical junctions would bark orders across the corpus callosum, which were perceived as external, perceived as real, and they could not be denied because, how can you can't shut your ears off, let alone if it's not even an auditory sound, it's in the brain. And so this is how decisions were made. And he traces this to the Iliad, in which there is no vestiges of subjective consciousness. Every action is made by a god telling somebody what to do. And so as over time, civilization grew and organizational modalities became so vast and sprawling, the bicameral mind broke down because this admonitory control system could no longer foresee all the various facets. And then with the invention of writing, the control system was externalized. And when you can read something, the voice is no longer interior. There's now a separation, what T.S. Eliot called, he said, between the gesture and the motion falls the shadow. And it is exactly that space between reading the voice, which reading is a sense of animism too, because you're synesthetically apprehending scribbles on a surface that read as a voice in the head. And it's exactly this kind of like the way a candle radiates heat, text or ink radiates something that sticks in our minds. And that's the voice that we hear, with which we reason. It's the kind of the phantom of the severed tongue that labors on inside our heads. So I consider this evolution from this bicameral mindset, where there's the guidance of a god or a daemon, or however you want to look at it, into what we are now, where we're our own gods in a sense, which creates its own line of problems. I consider that schizovereignty. So we go from schizophrenic mindsets to a schizovereign mindset, where we now are sovereign over our own split-mindedness. And in a very real sense, the pareidolic notion for me is a way to reconnect with those lost dimensions, those lost continents of the imagination. And so the idea of animism, like just as we project the mind space in each other's eyes, so also if you see a face in tree bark, you might project it in there, especially in more primitive civilizations. Which primitive, I don't mean in any kind of derogatory way. I just mean of an older guard, because in some ways I think it's actually quite more advanced. And then the idea again becomes, can you just look at it and say, hey, that tree has a face, whatever? Or can you look at it and say, that tree has a face and it's trying to tell me something, and really listen in? And I think that's where that's for me the sweet spot, where the one side seeps into the other. Okay.
Sarah, would you like to add any more to that?
No, that was a fantastic explanation. The only thing I would say is, it especially interested me reading about Julian Jaynes, not because he's got the same sounding name as me, but because it suggests to me that ancient people were perhaps more familiar with dreaming types of consciousness and memory, because there seemed to be this overlap between what we might call psychedelic consciousness these days and waking dreams, so that people felt more like they were inhabiting this imaginal space during ordinary waking consciousness. So, I mean, you mentioned we've been messaging back and forth a bit since the last session, and you mentioned that I think with Julian Jaynes, they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater a little bit in terms of modern neuroscience, because he has a lot of, I think, really incredible ideas and has done lots of really good research. But because neuroscientists now, I mean, from what I gather from I think it was Anil Seth who has just written the book Being You, and he's a neuroscientist who is the co-director of the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex. And I think because ideas of James's, such as this idea of auditory hallucinations, was kind of thrown out, and this idea of bicameralism was unpopular in terms of how well the brain is generally integrated these days, and that it isn't separated into these kind of compartments that it was previously thought. That they've kind of discounted the whole lot of his ideas, even though there's still some really great material in there, I think. And it certainly is something interesting to ponder and philosophize about as well. I think this idea, you know, I interview a lot of ancient historians, and I think because they're so desperate not to be aligned with the ancient aliens crowd or any kind of new age like craziness, very few of them will entertain the idea that our perception of the world, you know, the perception of the world to ancient people was very different. And I think that's seems to me to be like intuitively just wrong. I just don't believe that ancient people would have perceived the world in the same way that we do, just for the very sort of really the sort of practical elements of the culture and habits that existed in the time. You know, I think that culture and habit are the things that influence the way we see the world, and we can see that culture and habit was obviously very different in those times, and so I think therefore our perception of that world could be very different. And over thousands of years our perception of reality has changed considerably. Even in the last 100 years we can say that perception has changed amongst people quite a lot. You look at even sort of the Christianity, the influence of Christianity diminishing in Europe and things like that, that it would have been an ordinary thing for normal people to go to church all the time and recognize that there was a God and Jesus, where certainly Christianity is still evident, but you wouldn't say it's the vast majority of the population are part of this mythology. So I think that, to me, that's something I'm extremely interested in, is I love looking at historical documents, ancient texts, and trying to get myself in the mindset of an ancient person. And it's hard, it's very, very hard for us to imagine, because we're so used to everything existing in the modern world, we take it for granted. But a bit like the evolution of language, you know, I think there's a sort of common understanding. You read like Chaucer's English, it's pretty much unrecognizable from contemporary English. So you think how much language can change over time, and how metaphors as well culturally influence our perception of our environment, because metaphors are different in every country and every language as well. Mm-hmm. So I find that idea fascinating, you know, the idea that culture and habit do inform perception, and how, I mean, I guess material culture reveals something of that to us, but it certainly seems to me that ancient people had a bit more access to imaginal consciousness and that sort of conjuring, generating a visual image
as a guiding and divinatory principle too. Yeah, it wasn't just that it was they had access to it, but it was, you know, the whole idea that we have star signs and things like that, the shapes, pareidolia, these are culturally sanctioned pareidolia shapes, the constellations in the sky that would guide you. And like you're saying, Julian Jaynes said something like, it is impossible to reflect on a pre-reflective era. So even to conform your mind state to that of an earlier mind state is very difficult to do. And a lot of people will just give up even trying. And this is where what Professor Jan Sleutels calls the Flintstone fallacy, where we project our modern mindset, the modern Stone Age family, our modern mindset on this earlier state. So it's like, and it's something that happens now a lot too in culture, where, you know, like we want to cancel a movie from the 80s because of how we feel about things now, but that's not how it works. Things were different then. We looked at it differently. There's an evolution that takes place through the language, through the culture, through technical metaphors by which we have a different apprehension of the world, and we grow and we learn with that, you know?
I think it's a very important point here. When I was at university a million years ago in the 1970s, when I was doing my history degree, one of the things that we were taught was very much the factor we're discussing now. We were particularly focusing in on a school of French historians in the 1930s called Lani. And there were people such as Ferdinand Braudel and Marc Bloch. And what these guys did was quite revolutionary for the time, because what they said is that when you look at history, you have to try and see it through the eyes and perceptions of the characters within history. And I found it very evocative, because I think it was Braudel argued, he wrote a book called The Mediterranean. And he didn't talk about kings and queens and wars and battles. He talked about what it was like to be a peasant at that time. And the idea of, that when it went dark, it was dark. And there were dangers out there all the time. So the worldview of these individuals was very, very different. And I think it's very culturally chauvinistic to feel that we can project ourselves into the minds, because we know that anthropologists, it's the first thing that anthropologists train themselves not to do, is to make assumptions about other cultures. Yet we seem to want to do it historically.
Yeah.
But we won't do it relatively in modern times. And again, both your points about language here, that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that our language structures, our grammatical structures, balance and create and frame the way we see the world. And although maybe the original work of Edmund Lee Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf is slightly old-fashioned now, but effectively it still speaks truisms. Anybody that learns a foreign language, I mean, you as somebody that speaks Dutch and English and maybe other foreign languages, that you realize that it's a different thinking pattern. Even the way the grammar forms, effectively, some of the work I did in my sociology of language course, the idea, the way in which culturally, even the way time perception works depends upon how the verbs are structured.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very potent idea, that the tensions of time, past tense, present tense, future tense, the tensions of time are embedded within the fabric of the language. And so like the movie Arrival, based on the Ted Chiang story of your life, is a great example of exemplifying the notion of what happens if a language is created. And if you haven't
that was
seen
the
film,
only film, by the way, just jump in here. That's that. When I watched that film, it's the only film I've ever heard the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis discussed.
That's right. That's where I heard it. That's where I heard it from. Yeah. So in this film, there's an alien contact, but it's really focused on the language and the modes of communication with these alien forms, and the way that they communicate is through these Zen circles that are like a mix between one of those kentos, I think they're called, the Zen circle, and the Rorschach, kind of like a mix between those two. And then they find out that their language doesn't have tensions of time because it simultaneously apprehends past, present, and future. And then I won't give any spoilers away, but anybody that hasn't seen it, it's a must see. But yeah, language, I mean, it's also a magical principle. Language enforces reality. I can shape your reality by speaking it into existence to some degree. I can at least guide your perception through a reality, as I'm doing right now. As you're suspending your identity to some degree, weighing my words, you're following along this train of thought. And so it's absolutely something that plays out.
Well, we know that language and use of language and cadence of language can put people into altered states of consciousness. We know how hypnotism works, and hypnotism works on rhythm and lulling somebody into this altered state. We know how songs and sound and music are used. And Sarah, you with your work, it's very much your area, isn't it, rather than mine in terms of this?
Well, it's something I'm really, really interested in, is how language informs your perception of reality. And I was just going to say there, it reminds me a lot of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's ideas of the noosphere and the evolution of consciousness being the kind of product of this speeding up of this layer, this intellectual layer of the world, till we reach the omega point where we all become a kind of continuum. So I like this idea that there's been this recent research into how like information has sort of mass in the universe as well. I do think that we're sort of speeding up, evolutionarily speaking, like the consciousness of the planet. People are able to access so much more information, and if information has mass, then that gives it a kind of force in the universe as well, I imagine.
The time and space gets folded in on itself in a way, like through technologies, right? Like right now, you're in England, I'm in Miami, but we've collapsed the space barrier, and then we're able to send information like it used to. Maybe we'd have to do this podcast by pigeon, by postal pigeon. We have to send these messages back and forth. It's sped up incrementally right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is so fast the way we do things. I mean, sometimes I just think I'd really love to just live in a little shack on a Greek island and paint or look at the sea. And, I think that this is why so many people are encountering burnout, because I don't think human beings are made to cope with the speed that life goes at these days and the level of contactivity that we have. I think is also why conspiracy theories happen, because a bit like an oracular system, the internet can be used in that oracular type of way where you pick and choose what you see. You read the oracle based upon the amount of information that's available, and the amount of information that's available on the internet is infinite pretty much now. So you can pick out any information you want. So and
yet there's the pesky archon of the algorithm that limits our reach and often curates our contents based on previous content. So there is a self-limiting, and it is very archonic in that sense, isn't it? That is kind of like a force that's trying to like narrow our scope, but it can also be an agent of synchronicity, because that's why
you have to trick it. You have to search for stuff that you're not interested in and say things that you don't mean. And the other day I had a really brilliant experience of the algorithms. Like when I potter, when I'm just pottering around in my flat, I unconsciously start singing the Smurfs theme tune. And every single day, Amazon advertises me a Smurf hat fancy dress costume. And I hadn't made the connection until my kid's friend was over and said, "Is that the Smurfs theme tune?" And then I saw the hat at the same time. And I was like, wow, it must, because I don't ever search for Smurfs online. I only hum the theme tune. So it must be listening in on my theme tune humming.
Well, it's interesting now, isn't it? Because I'm reminded here, and it's a point that one of you made, and I can't remember which one it was, is the idea of the way in which we seem to be suffering from what Alvin Toffler called future shock. And of course, Toffler wrote that, I think, 1970, 71. And you think how in the late 60s, early 1970s, how society was changing and how technology was changing, to the changes of technology that we're dealing with now are just extraordinary. And as you said, we suffer from information overload. There is just so much information available there. We can just go down, drill into any particular interest we have. But the danger is we then start to echo box, and we just find the bits of information that reinforce our particular prejudices. And funnily enough, I've only recently come back from Greece, and I spent 2 weeks, and I particularly was interested in drilling into conspiracy theories, the sociology of it, the psychology of them. And I read about 8 books on conspiracy theories. And it's really quite fascinating how that dynamic works. Very, very intriguing how we are reinforcing, and we are all almost becoming silo thinkers, and we're becoming divided rather than seeking out and sharing information as we're doing. What people do is they just want to hear what they want to hear.
Well, it's interesting that, isn't it? If you think about what James was doing and how he was looking at the history of consciousness, then we can project based upon our current habits and culture how consciousness will evolve. I mean, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was well ahead of the curve, because he did predict, a lot of artists and writers have predicted this stuff, because part of being artistic is being visionary and be able to imagine and see the future. So yeah, I think we could probably make really good guesses at how consciousness might evolve based upon the habits and cultures that we have these days. I mean, digital dementia is now an issue that's affecting young people. So people are essentially developing a kind of dementia based upon the fact that they're overusing devices and therefore not using their own memory capabilities and are not able to remember stuff, and are having kind of what would be associated with age-related dementia really early. Mm-hmm. So if you think that's happening already, who knows what's going to happen? Maybe the breakdown of the bicameral mind has happened, but now we might return to the bicameral mind because we're
that is exactly right. That's where I was going to touch on to this, because like I talked about earlier, like for me, it's largely these practices, these artistic pareidolik practices are largely about reconnecting with this lost continent, right? This lost continent of guidance and of imagination and things like that. And you mentioned earlier, like people go to the church and things like that. This is another a vestige of this, like this desire to reconnect with this lost continent, of this forlornness for the departed gods, and this need for guidance, which is how divination came about. Like once, this is in the speculative Jamesian sense, like once the bicameral mount broke down and we didn't have these guiding voices anymore, that's when we came up with the idea of divination, hence my idea of the divine to design. It's a way to summon the will of the divine, or the man behind the curtain, or the daemon, or the larger part of ourselves, to give us some kind of guidance. And I think that what's happening in technology right now, especially with AI and with people outsourcing, like this idea of digital dementia, is so potent. I hadn't heard that term, but I'm taking care of my father who has Alzheimer's, so I'm very like attuned to this idea of how these things come about. And I think a large thing, if you're outsourcing your imagination, if you're outsourcing your writing skills, all these things that where beauty is born out of struggle, or achievement is born out of struggle, out of duende, as Lorca called it, a kind of like
out of boredom quite often as well. And no one has the opportunity to be bored, because we're so like mindlessly distracted, and we'll watch videos of women putting on like tight pants, or people doing their makeup, or cakes that look like boots instead. And I mean, that is ridiculous. I remember when the TV show Nathan Barley came out, and it kind of pre-cognized the kind of world that we live in now. And I remember at the time watching that thinking, we'll never be that stupid, or idiocracy. And now you can really see how we are basically living in idiocracy times, in terms of people's, like, they're just distracted to death.
And I think this idea of outsourcing our authority is what leads to the decline in mystery, like you were saying earlier. It's like, it's all like the legends on the map have all been mapped. There's nothing new under the sun, but there's more if you look inwards, or you turn your, I always say, let those who are without insight look out. If you turn your inward interiority outward, as we've been talking about, you may find something new under the sun. And I think that, especially with the idea of AI now and this outsourcing of imagination, it's I think going to lead to a kind of techno bicamerality, where the AI becomes the guiding force that we once had from the hallucinated gods. But the danger in this is there's somebody broadcasting from behind the screen. There are corporate agendas designing, engineering, and overlooking this process. So I feel like that this is a move back towards a technological crutch, a technological admonitory system. And, the idea of government becoming more totalitarian, or more like godlike in the Old Testament sense, or like the Yahweh sense, almost like this archonic control system becomes more prevalent. And so I feel that there's a lot of potential of co-creation and interactivity with these technologies, and there's also a lot of obvious peril, the side of dementia not being the least of that.
I think your points are incredibly valid here. And about a year ago, I met up with a Californian Australian called Terry Hawkins, and she is a very, very successful business trainer. And she trains people in terms of business orientations and Lord knows what else. And one of the things that her major concern is the way in which technology is changing young people now. The point that Sarah was making, that suddenly people aren't thinking for themselves in the same way, that we had to. So I was thinking this, when I was at university, you couldn't get hold of books or articles. So you had to literally go to the library and reserve them. And you'd have the book for 6 hours, and you would have to read it as part of a research for an essay, which you would then go away and you would handwrite.
Wow.
Whereas now, you can hone things, you can get information from anywhere. I mean, I find it extraordinary. I'm starting research now for my latest book, and virtually every academic article I need, I can get. And I can, get the article, read it, and then incorporate it within minutes, within seconds. Whereas even 15, 20 years ago, when I first started writing, you couldn't do that, which means in many ways that if you are an eclectic thinker, it's probably to your advantage, because you can follow all the trails that you want to find the things you want, or you can drill down, or you can drill across. But if you've got a bee in your bonnet and you're believing the world has a particular agenda, or that people are trying to control us in some way, the information is also there. And of course, because these days there's no way of proving whether your information source is correct or not. And it's one thing
influencing the amount of ADHD diagnoses that are going around these days as well, I would imagine, just because of what we're subjected to. Our brain can't really cope with the amount of information. So, I mean, I think it's interesting what you say, because I remember, you know, I was a teenager, or probably early 20s before the internet became a regular thing. And I remember having to go to libraries, and it was really hard to try and find the stuff that you wanted to find. You had to, like you say, order it in. But also there's an element whereby you had to read it within the context of an entire book, and you had to read that book slowly because you couldn't rush it. Whereas now, because I promote events and I organize events, and I'm doing bios and writing information, I'm constantly being told stuff like, people can't read more than 3 lines, don't make it more than 5 lines. And I kind of think, well, that's catering and encouraging this having no attention span, which is something I don't want to do. But it's what you're told you have to do these days to sell any events or any ideas. So it's really, really challenging. But I do think that it is a contributing factor in the amount of ADHD diagnoses, for sure.
It's funny, you know, because it used to be people would aspire to write the great American novel, and now you're lucky if you get the great American hashtag or the great American tweet or something like that. But I put out a book earlier this year called Impatient Transformations. There's only like 300 copies of it left. And I kind of catered to this, but not in a way where I compromised. It's full of like little poems and pithy little short stories and fables and things like that, where I'm trying to keep it as pithy as possible, but it has a lot of pith. Like every little sentence can unfold in the mind. Like you can open it up and there's like more inside of it, you know? So it has a very multidimensional quality to it, because I do think that in order for people to read, if they don't have the attention span to go through, and also the auditory side is coming back more, the oratory side, like podcasts are huge because people can just take it in and read on the road, and audiobooks and things, which Tony, your Labyrinth of Time was a great audiobook because your narration was also so calm and soothing, and just like, I love it when the author gets to recite their own work in their own voice because it comes alive.
You know, I had to audition to do that.
Are you kidding? That's hilarious.
Literally.
Well, I mean, it makes sense because not everybody is a reliable narrator in that sense. You know, like some people don't have that, but you had a very good, just theatrical presence where you know what you're saying, and you're holding the attention in how you're saying it. Because a lot of people will kind of just like, you know, stumble over it trying to get through it, but you really like honed in, which,
I think this is an interesting area to pursue now, because I think one of the things that the use of language and the use of communication now means that in many ways it's more intimate. You know, as you say, that you have a more intimate relationship with the author when you're reading their words, because you're hearing them saying it. And there's almost an immediate, you know, whereas there is, as you were both saying earlier on, there's this kind of transference, whereas you read the words on the page, the words then stimulate internal sounds in your head or words in your head. Or is it more than that? You know, it immediately evokes images. So you see the word and you see the image, and you put the images together and you build this picture. Whereas when the author is reading it, it becomes more so. And it's interesting to discuss, isn't it, as to whether it's as effective if you're listening to a novel or a piece of fiction, as to whether that particularly matters, whether it's the author or not. Whereas non-fiction, particularly very personal non-fiction, I think you very much need to hear the author. Now, somebody like yourself that has this brilliant delivery and the way in which you can go into different accents and everything else as well, you have a phenomenal talent there. So I would imagine that your books, when and if you do get the opportunity to do Audible, will be very, very powerful, because I'm going to just imagine you really enjoying going off into accents and things like that as well. And I think this is an interesting thing, isn't it? How the process of information works how we take written words and change them. Because Sarah, you know, with your particular area of interest, you know, in terms of Egyptian hieroglyphs, you know, because we've discussed this many times, but do you find when you read hieroglyphs, do you phoneticize it in your brain, or do you just imbue the principle and the ideals behind the symbols?
Well, I'm not that good at reading hieroglyphs for starters, but I do both, which is why hieroglyphs are so interesting, because you can't help but make associations with what the images represent, but you also become familiar with what their phonetic values are as well. So it's an interesting language because it is kind of cross-disciplinary in a way, like it engages different areas of the brain in a way that English doesn't, or languages that use regular alphabets don't, because you don't make those kind of visual associations. But so, for example, like it also means that you read more into the words in a way as well, because of the particular images that are used to represent that word. So you start to make quite novel associations with that word based upon those visual images, if you get what I mean. But I found that really interesting. Just, you know, in terms of language and in terms of deep listening, this idea of how you engage with information, because people learn in different ways. You know, I always find it amazing when people say they can't read books, like they just actually can't read a book. And lots and lots and lots of people say they can't read a book, which is incredible to me. And then I can't remember who I was talking to Greg Moffat, and he said he doesn't read any non-fiction anymore because he doesn't want, I mean, he doesn't read novels anymore because he doesn't want to read anything that he doesn't learn anything from. And I love reading novels because I think you learn so much stuff from novels, because especially if they're written in a certain time period, you get this amazing like first-hand experience of that time period, and you have a more emotional, direct connection with it. So I love reading novels, and a lot of people don't like novels at all, which I've noticed is mostly men. No offense, it's mostly like men that don't like reading novels. But another thing with regards to listening, like I know a lot of people have podcasts on in the background, and I can't do that. I can't do two things at once. Like I couldn't have a podcast in the background if I was trying to work or do something else. And so I don't really often listen to podcasts. That's kind of why I prefer the Zoom things, because you engage more because you're looking at someone talking. But another thing that strikes me is it's also affected the way in which we engage with music, because music used to always be a deep listening experience. If you go from like concerts where you had to basically be in the room with a live band or live musicians, to utter engagement and attention to the musicians, to just listening to stuff in the background, to kids these days listening to stuff on phones. I remember like the first time, I must have been in my 20s when I started to listen to, like, teenagers would have their music on their phones on the bus. And to me, it was like, no one would ever listen to music on a phone. Why would you even bother? Like, you can't listen to it properly. It's like really bad sound quality. Why would anyone ever do that? And now that's just become the normal way. Not only that, with adverts in it as well. So people are listening to music that's got adverts sprinkled in it. And, you know, you think about the times when bands would release a record, and then that entire record would create this world, and you would listen to that record from start to finish, and that record would make up this mini world that you could be in for a while, and you had to listen to the whole thing, and you couldn't just pick and choose whatever track you wanted to listen to from any artist ever. And, you know, you think about sort of the way Spotify playlists work these days, that people don't even decide what music they want to listen to. They're like, I'm in the mood for like lazy Sunday afternoon music, and they'll just bung that on, and that's just in the background, you know. So I think there's something to be said for returning to that, like, entirely directed by the outside world consciousnness, where we're not actually really making any decisions at all. We're given this illusion of choice, and this illusion of choice is rubbish.
Well, this is exactly why I think this kind of techno bicamerality could very easily arise as this revival, because also, like I mentioned, it was when the written word became more prevalent that the bicameral mind broke down. And as now we're becoming more illiterate, or at least to the sense that we don't read as much, it's very prominent, like you're just saying, like now we're letting the external world dictate what we listen to, how we listen to it. Like what comes up, you're saying the adverts are in there with the music, which was in the movie Demolition Man. That's all they listened to was jingles. That was their music on the radio, their favorite jingles. And I was also a musician, and I came very much from that Pink Floyd school of like creating concept albums and these kinds of things. And yeah, in the Spotify world, it's it's randomized, and it doesn't hold the same kind of weight. Another thing that came up was because you had talked about your expedition report collection, and this kind of like through reading different time periods, getting in touch with the mindset of that time, which is something beautifully exemplified in Jeremy Narby's book, Shamans Through Time, which is a 600 years of expedition reports, starting with like missionary expeditions to different places and encountering shamanic cultures. And first it's like, it's witchcraft, and it's like they don't understand it because they're projecting their own new world perspectives on these practices. And so it's heresy, it's witchcraft, it's, it needs to be, the wilderness needs to be tamed, kind of thing, needs to be converted. But then as the accounts go on, we get to like the modern day where we can like recognize the intrinsic values in these systems of thought and systems of divination and healing. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting about these expedition accounts that I've collected. They're from the 30s and 40s, and even within the time frame of creating that book, they changed their mind. But we just didn't listen. Like, it became very obvious to those European explorers that the people living there, the indigenous people of that area, were much better equipped and knowledgeable about their area. But that wisdom wasn't heeded because these people were still in the minority, and people were just trying to monetize the land, and had these assumptions about how the land must be incredibly rich because it supports such an extraordinary amount of biodiversity. But yeah, I mean, there's a really tragic one. I think it's the Mato Grosso expedition, where they're collecting for a Brazilian natural history museum, and they just shoot every single thing they see. And shooting was the equivalent of photographing things in this time period. Like, they would just shoot to show that they saw something. So they created, essentially, as part of this expedition, a mountain of corpses, and the birds and the animals there were so tame, they were so not scared of humans, that there was even a small bird that came into the camp and was helping them pack the dead bodies of the other birds. And just weird, like, I mean, they're really, really amazing, interesting books, because they're just written from actually being there at a time when no Westerners at that point had ever contacted these people. And they're fascinating to read because of that. And they're completely, I mean, they're the kind of thing that would get cancelled these days, because there's a lot of really derogatory terms in there. But like, in like, just, I don't think there's a single one where where the mindset of the writer doesn't change throughout the course of writing the book. And they nearly always, I mean, I'm sure they always end up having a lot of respect for these people, because they save them, they know how to survive in a really inhospitable and dangerous environment, and they obviously have like an incredible relationship with their environment, which is undeniable. So I mean, they're amazing. There's is it Mark Plotkin wrote Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, is a really fantastic book with regards to the kind of Western mindset. He was a ethnobotanist, and so he went to do a year out in the Amazon and has never come back, basically, because he loved it so much. But because he was an ethnobotanist and was very familiar with botany, the shamans kind of respected him because he could recognize different plant species and things like that. So I think very often the indigenous populations wouldn't share their wisdom with people because they didn't trust that it would be used for good, or they didn't think it would be understood properly. But because Mark Plotkin did demonstrate a lot of knowledge to them, they've shared a lot with him. And now he runs the Amazon Conservation Trust, and he works to connect indigenous villagers with people that can protect when illegal logging and stuff like this is happening. So he's an amazing person as well. Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, amazing. And he went in very, very sort of cynical and reductionist, materialist scientist, and just, it blew his mind, the stuff that he experienced in the Amazon.
It's so beautiful to see that, the way that an exploration changes a person's mindset, to go into something one way and then come out of it the other side another way. And I'd be curious, Tony, because you've been on this research train, you've written 13 books now, or you're working on your 13th book. I'd be very curious, because I've always admired the way, like, I've always been very much, oh, the recording stopped. The host left. Oh, what happened here? He was intimidated by my question. Oh, here he is.
No, I'm back. I'm back.
Right.
The Archons obviously were listening. The Archons were obviously listening in.
I was saying that, I've always gone at it in my explorations that, I'm trying to get it all straight before I would put out, like now I'm putting out like smaller publications, but I was just thinking like large tome style. But I've always admired the way you've gone into your exploration, wrote your first book, and then every book since then has been kind of a revision of the ideas, a polishing, a growing of the ideas, and like sometimes specialized branches of it get a spotlight. How has this journey of consciousness research and exploring the cheating the ferryman theory through these various facets, how has that transformed you and your outlook?
Completely and utterly, completely, totally. I found that the whole writing process was, I've used the analogy that when I wrote Cheating the Ferryman, when I came up with the Cheating the Ferryman concept, that it was rather like I was Henry Schliemann discovering Troy, in that, the story that Schliemann had an idea that there was, that Troy had not been a legend, and the Iliad actually took place, and there was a place called Troy. And he had a vague idea that it was going to be somewhere in northern Turkey, or the Northern Ottoman Empire, the northern Aegean coastline. And he had a vague idea that there was this hill called the Hill of Hisaluk that sat outside, I think it was Kanakkale. And he started digging. And as he started digging, he started discovering different cities and different towns. And as you know, Troy, there's about 6 or 7 different Troys that are on top of each other. And as you drill in, he was discovering more and more. And I felt that's what I found when I started writing my work, in that I didn't have any idea where I was going. I didn't know what I was doing or even why I was writing it, but it started to come to me. So I'd just follow my daemon. My daemon would point me in a particular direction, and I'd just follow it. And then I'd find the information I needed. So the theory or the hypothesis was not something I even vaguely knew where I was going to go with it. And every single book that I've done that, what tends to happen with me is I write a book and then I write it again. And it always happens. I've got different versions of all my books because I discover more things. And as you discover more things, that bit seems to fit in. And it's as if you're being guided in some way. So in many ways, I feel that my own writing is very much an extension of me and a way of me trying to understand what this is all about. Because I think that's why I started writing, because I wanted to understand. And I found the only way to do it was to write, but to follow my own muse and follow that route. And I think that's what I would like to believe that's what most writers do, and I still sit back and I think, my God, I've just started writing my 13th book and publishers are now approaching me to write books for them. And you're going, this is just bizarre. I'm just an ordinary working class kid from Liverpool or from Merseyside. But it's been an extraordinary experience. And I've met such wonderful people. I mean, really, it is just incredible, the people I've met over the last 15, 20 years. Just such interesting people. I have a whole new world of people, like meeting Sarah, meeting you, it's and we all find that we get on so well. There seems to be this kind of movement where we all reflect each other's values and we all support each other and we all add a little bit. As I've said in the past, I'm sure that one day we'll all get together and we'll all add our little bit of color to this painting. And we'll see the real world. We will crack the matrix. we will realize in one of these discussions that the light will go on and we'll go, oh, that was what it was all about. Oh, that's pretty mundane, isn't it? 42. It's 42.
I think that's the beauty. One of the most rewarding things about kind of shining a beacon through your work. Like, you're following your own interests. In your case, it started with an interest in déjà vu and seeing where that led you. And then all these other places start opening up and the lines start connecting, and then you start meeting other people and other thinkers and other creators, and it becomes this constellation too. Like, for instance, Julian Jaynes is something that ties all three of us together. Philip K. Dick. There's all these different, you step onto a certain path and the stones that are paved are different influences. Even then, there are parts where it's not paved and you step off the path, and that's where you will put your stone, almost like that Hollywood Walk of Fame, but for thinkers. And I found it as well, like at some point, because I didn't wait for gatekeepers, I didn't wait to finish my work. I started putting out this podcast, doing interviews with people, and then creating these intros in which oftentimes I'll share soundscape audiobook versions of my own writings. And again, it's like it's this beacon or vortex that's opened up, and then you meet people that are drawn to that, who then also have little pieces of the puzzle, and it just becomes so fascinating to see. And I'm very malleable in my mindset. Like, my beliefs are not set in stone. They're more intuitions I follow, and things that I play with form. It's a very mercurial process. And so for me also, like, going through my explorations and pushing it up against other thinkers, and often, like, I really like it when my ideas get challenged in interesting and intellectual ways. Like, I had that conversation with Jason Horsley, who you also know, who came from this kind of occult and psychedelic background, but then had completely disregarded it at some point, and now he's completely against it. So we got together and we had this conversation where we had a very good overlap of interests and of skill sets. But there was, he called it the Vesica Pisces, it overlaps, but there's areas of divergence. And he, I was a little apprehensive about his more conspiratorially minded side, and he was a little apprehensive about my psychedelic side. But we had great conversations, respectfully, Socratically. We're able to, respectfully agree or disagree. And I've taken things from my interactions with him, for instance, that have altered the way I look at certain things, made me reframe them, made me look more critically at certain things. And I find that extremely valuable.
I think it's very important because people sometimes criticize writers like myself because we change our opinions, but that's what it's all about. I'm not writing to prove anything. What I'm doing is I'm putting the ideas out there for people to come back to me, say that doesn't make any sense. And as you rightly say, that's great, because that's what I want people to do. I want people to say that doesn't make any sense, because it helps me. Exactly. I'm nobody special. We are not special people. We are fortunate to find ourselves in these kind of life circumstances where we can follow our muse. But it doesn't mean we're any better or that we have any better knowledge basis than others. But I just find that it is intriguing that the people that are drawn to this, and it's not my movement, it's our movement, that, as you say, people bring this little bit, and every person brings it. I mean, Sarah and I, when we meet up with our little group in London, and we all sit around for hours and we just chatter. And I'm high for hours afterwards, just on the sheer joy of sharing information. And we love this, don't we, Sarah? We love doing this because it's so wonderful. And it doesn't matter if nobody's even listening, because that's not what we're about. It's about the dynamic, it's about the learning, and it's about the understanding. And one of the things I find now when you get to my age is you realize that you don't have that much time left. And I've lost a number of very dear friends in the last few months who are just dying because we're getting older, and you realize that you have little time, and you need to rush to get the information. I think it was a point we were saying before, that because we now have a cornucopia of information that is available to us, the challenge is, where do you go? Because there's so many books you need to read, so many people you need to interface with. You sometimes get terrified by it all. And you think, am I going to miss this bit of information? And as writers, we all have that great fear, don't we? That, you finish writing your book and then suddenly there's this fantastic bit of information that would have made all sense, and you've already published it. And it's too late.
Well, that's where the next book comes in, right? That's already like the ramp onto the next one.
There is, and it's because Sarah's new book is out and is doing phenomenally well and getting a lot of really nice accolades, which is wonderful to hear, isn't it?
It makes things like this as well. It's what the internet was supposed to be for. I think that there's a great beauty in the fact that we can all connect with like-minded people now, and we need to be using it more for all the brilliant reasons and less for all the mind-numbing digital dementia type reasons. And I guess that, you know, I think that being offline is now a bit of a luxury, but we should use the internet for our advantage and for our development, which I think it's an incredible tool for it. I mean, if you think about being at university studying, what you would have done to have a tool like the internet then, rather than have to go through the library and order books, and how quickly and how much you would have achieved, you know, if you had this like power at your disposal then. But people are so used to it now, they just take it for granted, I guess. And it's the same as, I guess, the easier our lives become, the more lazy we become. It's just a sort of human habit to, generally speaking, do that. It's a bit like, you know, I go swimming in the sea every morning with my daughter, and it's freezing cold and raining. And it's weird sometimes because I don't want to necessarily do it, but every time I do, it makes me feel glad to be alive. And there's something about, you know, I don't know, doing something that's a bit hard or a bit grafty feeling that actually is really good for human beings, and feeling like you've worked and earned something kind of can make it really special and valuable. And I think that we're living in a very sort of plastic and disposable type of society, but it's not sustainable. So we're probably going to have to go back to looking after ourselves a bit better and being more resourceful in the very near future, in which case those kind of tools are going to come in very handy. And imagine us now with no internet as well. I mean, there's already studies that show that children that are, you know, really used to having their devices become incredibly panic stricken and anxious if their devices are taken away from them. So imagine if we suddenly had the internet cut off, how everyone would cope. It'd be so bizarre. It just seems like something we take for granted so much these days. And it's become like electricity to us, and then water or food. So yeah, I think there are interesting times ahead, because our current way of living is unsustainable. And probably, I mean, you'll be all right, Tony. You don't have to worry about all of this kind of stuff.
I'll be gone.
You know,
I'll be
my
going
daughter
back.
and her, you know, my daughter and generations after her, you know, I just wonder what kind of world they're going to inherit.
Well, it's funny too, because please. Just the way that older generations may be intimidated by something like the internet or the technologies that we have now, the way that we might be intimidated by getting offline and going into nature and having to listen deeply, having to lengthen our attention span. But like once that happens, you know, time dilates and the present becomes ever present, and that's where like really you can bloom. And it's so necessary to have this natural digital detox kind of experience, you know. And I think of it also in the sense of, right now there's the writer's strike happening in Hollywood, and the actors are striking with that as well. And I think about this, if this kind of like Black Mirror, Joan is Awful, I don't know if you saw that recent episode where it's also The Congress is a film that has a similar idea where people's likeness is getting co-opted with AI, and like now you can just watch this show with yourself in it, and your likeness being, you know, the actor's likeness is just being robbed. They're not getting compensated for it. If that is the way things go, so like entertainment, custom curated for every person, but with no writer's imagination, no actor's imagination involved, just this generic kind of thing, then I think there will be a revival of the theater arts, which would not be a bad thing, because what a beautiful thing to be in the presence of live performance. Like you were saying earlier, Sarah, about how the media landscape of music has changed so much. Like David Byrne brought this up, that everything changed with the invention of the microphone, because it used to be you'd find acoustic spaces, sacred spaces, like a church or a chapel or a cave or whatever might resonate with these divine acoustics that amplify the voice. And now suddenly we have the microphone, this like amplified cathedral that we get to take with us and affect in any which way. And so then music used to be this direct, immediate theatrical experience, which is also the roots of shamanism, or the roots of entertainment is in shamanism. It used to be that it was a theatrical performance in which the shaman, who was a lot of times a ventriloquist and, you know, a shapeshifter and a thespian in some ways, would act out his journey into the underworld that the audience would then vicariously go along with, and, you know, through act of placebo or perhaps some supernatural intervention would be able to heal their illness. So it's almost like it's a got your nose kind of thing, you know. It's like separating the thumb trick. It's like it's a kind of illusionism that was taking place, and then that evolved into something separated from the healing and divinatory modalities into entertainment, into commerce. But there is, of course, always still that beating heart of duende, that magical spark of meaning in all these modalities. Of course, there's still music that has healing properties, that can transport you. Of course, there are films that you won't walk out of the theater the same way you walked in. Like, these things are still there, but as things become, as there's the threat of becoming more generic, there's also the tension of kind of the revival of older modalities. And it's funny because you, Sarah, you're putting on this event in Athens, and I imagine there's, that's like, isn't that where the theater began? Or at least in Greece, right?
Well, they
That's like
certainly thought the theatre was extremely important in Greece. And I've just come back from Epidavros, where they have one of the most well-preserved amphitheatres, which has got beautiful acoustics as well. I mean, it's famed for its acoustics, but that was part of a healing sanctuary. And so the dramatic performances there were seen to be like a cathartic, dramatic healing practice. So there's going to be some of that in Athens, for sure.
Well, it's one of these things that both of you probably, if you haven't checked it out, one of the previous INCONs I had was with Dr. Alan Roberts and with Murray, can't think of his first name now, but Brian Murray's son. And we were discussing about the theatre and how the theatre these days is losing out, particularly Shakespearean theatre, purely and simply because the size of the casts. So it's very expensive now because you can't afford to pay the amount of people that you would have to put a Shakespearean performance on. And of course, because people are now wanting immediate free entertainment because you can get it so easily on YouTube and everything else, the live performances are dying in many, many ways, which is so sad because, of course, live theatre is such a visceral thing. And as Dr. Roberts was explaining, because his PhD is in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we were discussing about the magical in Shakespeare and the magical in the theatre, and how you like, for instance, he said, and it was quite fascinating, the way in which in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and I'd forgotten this, that the initial sections in A Midsummer Night's Dream, they're in Athens. So the first scenes are in Athens, and then they walk out of the town and they're in the British Midlands. They're in the Forest of Arden outside Stratford-upon-Avon with very English characters in one way or another. But you accept that because that's what theatre does, doesn't it? It's an escape into this other place, which theatre was what it was all about. And I think, Michelangelo, your point there is an incredibly valid one, and one I hadn't been thinking about.
Yeah, it's also having more of these spaces for people to gather and experience live music, experience.
Jake Murray, by the way, it was Jake Murray. Just
okay. These places to like have oration and entertainment that's immersive in the most primal sense, in a way, just like a person speaking and taking you on a journey with their words, or an actor playing something out, or a music like taking you on these journeys. It's so important for these places to exist. And I'm very lucky. I recently discovered, I haven't been there yet, but I'm going to New York next month. And it's a place called the Athenaeum, which is funny because it's Athens again. There's this Athens thread. The Athenaeum is this psychedelic library and social club and event space in New York City that recently started, and they commissioned me to write and record a voiceover in Terence McKenna's voice to promote the origin story and the mission statement of their business. And it looks like an amazing space where they put on all kinds of events like that. And I'm actually going to be putting on an art show with some of the pieces that I shared on the last episode. I'll be putting on some art, and I'll be doing a presentation, some storytelling there as well. So I'm very excited to kind of meet the community there. So if anybody that's listening now is in New York, please connect with me. I would love to see if we can get you there in the audience and see where the journey can take us.
That's a very interesting point, isn't it? That your mimicry and your ability to do that spontaneously. I mean, your Werner Herzog thing obviously is just unbelievable.
Yes.
And again, it shows, doesn't it, how a talent. You can actually become somebody else. I mean, when you do that, do you find your psychology changes when you speak differently?
It does. It's, I had this alter ego, which I put out these music videos and this album under the name Void Denizen. And what happened was, at some point, I'd watched that Sigil, and it's funny because this goes back to the Austin Osman Spare, I am only familiar with his art mostly through his philosophy of sigil magic, which I learned about through Grant Morrison in his misinformation speech. And I found it so whimsical, the way that Grant Morrison was speaking in this Glaswegian accent, but it wasn't like the Trainspotting Glaswegian accent, like you could actually hear what he was saying, but just the way, the cadence of his speech and the way that the words unfurl, there's a certain twist of tongue and a certain lyrical charm that really, captivates an audience. And so I got stuck in this voice for 6 days. Like, I woke up one morning and my roommate was like, "Good morning." I said, "Good morning." I was like, "Oh shit." I couldn't shake it. And then I started noticing these twists and turns of phrase working in a certain way, and I created these songs out of it. Like, it started with this rap called Shrimp Pimp, and they were just like the most ridiculous lyrics that came to me that sounded so good in this accent, which was, "You could be a shrimp pimp at a prawn shop with your pump boots and your flat top, with your broom box and your rag top. You got soap scum rocking in a headlock." Like, just things that nobody has ever said before, And I started building off of that. But I think a lot about mimicry, because of my mimicrist abilities, is that it's a kind of hyper empathic diplomacy where I suspend myself in order to absorb the pattern of somebody's speech, which is the pattern of their body as well, the pattern of their thinking. And in a sense, this is a uniquely human talent to become what we behold, where we can suspend ourselves and really feel our surroundings and be impressed by our surroundings or by other people, and in that sense, in a very Janesian sense, understand them, because Julian Jaynes proposed that the feeling of understanding is the feeling of familiarity. So in order to understand something, we actually, in the metaphor generated model of our minds, replace the actual thing with a metaphor. So we supplant it, for instance, with a word. So by now saying that that's a butterfly, the majesty of this fluttering creature and all their colors is eclipsed by my understanding through a simple word, butterfly. So to kind of melt away those apprehensions and be able to feel the actual vibrational being there and be able to emulate that is kind of that's why they say it's the greatest form of flattery is imitation, because now it's a sense of understanding intrinsically. And I'll try to open this up in a short way, but I had this was one of my pivotal psychedelic moments around 2007, which is around the time that we were first in contact, Tony. And I was doing these different psychedelic rituals in different places, and I was trying to unearth a manuscript from the vaults of eternity. I had these kind of Mephistophelian ambitions. And what happened at some point on a high dose of mushrooms in the desert of Joshua Tree is that the landscape overwhelmed me, not as a visual composition, but it's it became unmuted, and the landscape was pure vibration and sound. And it started moving through my body, and I started beatboxing, and the sound came out that was like the industrial engine of the desert. It sounded something like all sizzle and crackle and snap and pop. And it felt like what was happening was that there were these almost pneumatic tubes moving through the landscape, like current channels moving through the air that were delivering particular vibrations to my being. For instance, the vibration of that cactus up in the distance, or those coyotes down the way. And I would feel the sensations of these things, and I would become them for a moment, and it would exemplify itself through this sound and through this song. And the words that came out was, "All I want is water. The desert feeds me dreams." And I was drowning in this river of dream. And then I realized that I was emulating the sound. The song I was hearing was coming through me, almost like I became this pranic piston that was I was like a mouthpiece for the desert in that moment. And in the years that I reflected on this experience, this pure Shakespearean madness that became like a rock opera among the rocks throughout the night, I thought of these vibrational pulses that delivered the information to me, and I called them intuitively metronomes. Now, later, when I broke that apart, you have a metronome, like the little timekeeper, right? But then the way I thought of it was metronomes with a G, like the gnomes. But if you look at that differently, they're metrogenomes. And so then I was like, but what is a genome? So I started looking up genomes. And of course, the genome is the pocket of genetic information that makes up the basic architecture of a being. So like a monkey has a genome, a human has a genome, probably different plants have genomes. And so my interpretation of this is that, and this is very Narbian as well, because Jeremy Narby's idea with the cosmic serpent, that what we're interfacing with in our environment is like we're exchanging genetic information or epigenetic information with our environment and responding accordingly and adapting, is that in this altered state, as my ego became suspended, and in some sense there was a kind of a shamanic exaltation of the ego also that often comes with or after ego dissolution. What happened in this moment of suspension was that these metronomes, these like immaterial, now personified beings, were delivering the genomes of different beings to me so that I could sample them and try them on for size. And in a sense, the funny thing is I wanted to retrieve this book, this manuscript from the eternal repositories, but what I ended up doing is, in a sense, I became my own scripture made flesh on the stage of life. And it's like I came alive. I stepped out of the page of my self-perception in my head and became an active participant in the environmental cosmic theater. So then I call that Thea Terra, which is goddess earth, Thea Terra, and it's also theater, and Ra, which is the theater of the earth, spotlit by the sun god, which then became a musical project through which I tried to tell some of these wild tales in music.
That was extraordinary. That was an extraordinary description. The way you use language is incredible, and the way in which you elucidate your ideas is mind-blowing. It really is quite something. You're an extraordinarily talented.
the way language uses me.
Yes, possibly the way it challenges through you. But right, I'm aware we're coming towards the end now. Sounds like the final line from a I don't know, an album by Yes or something, I suppose. But I'm sure that there's going to be an awful lot of people out there that are going to be absolutely fascinated by you and what you do and everything else as well. And I know that you are a man of many levels and many mysteries, but how could people check out your work or contact you? What websites do you want to be aware of and everything else as well? Because I know that you have various personas, and it's which personas you wish to put across.
Yeah, the easiest way to find my many scattered selves is through theungoogleable.com, and that's where you'll be able to find links to my Instagram, to my Facebook, to my podcast, Self Portraits as Other People, which also has a great episode that Tony and I did together a few years ago, which you can check out. I'd say check out theungoogleable.com and just start clicking on things and digging away and forging your own way through the labyrinth.
And you will have, guys, you'll have a wonderful adventure. And Sarah, I just like to give you the opportunity to maybe mention about your future events as well, as to what you're up to, because I know you're up to a lot of exciting stuff at the moment.
Oh, well, can I mention the Dream Palace event?
Of course you can. That's what I was leading into.
So I'm organising a 10-day retreat and 3-day kind of symposium, multiple venue, performance, music, all sorts of shenanigans in Athens this October. So there's a lot of stuff going on for that, but the website to look at is thistadreampalace.com, and all of the information is there. But I mean, I'm hoping you can come as well, Michael. Tony, I hope you can come, and hopefully Tony will be talking and maybe doing some workshopy type stuff with our residents. And I mean, my interest is, as you've gathered from what I've brought up during this session, is like the ancient history and culture of perception, especially with regard to dreaming. So this event explores the history and culture and the arts of dreaming. And I think, you know, this is what we're missing. I think what we're missing in culture is dreaming and the imaginal, and not in a, you know, there's the psychedelic renaissance is happening for good reason, but I think the worlds of dreaming have been neglected in this, and they're kind of brothers and sisters. So I think it's important to bring dreaming back as a source of inspiration to creative culture. I mean, you mentioned, Michael, this idea of entertainment becoming generic. I think it already is horribly generic, and people are just spoon-fed it, and they're not, because they're so distracted and there's almost too much choice out there, they're not creating enough new culture. You know, I mean, you're an incredibly unusual person these days to be creating as much new culture as you are. But I think that's something that I'm keen to encourage, is this idea of, if you don't like what's out there, create your own stuff, and trying to get people together who want to create things together as well. So as part of this creative residency, a lot of it is about people coming and creating their own work and working with our artists in residence. And then we're going to have a Snake Mardi Gras party at the end of it, where people can do their own performances and have their own art exhibitions or whatever. So there's a lot of scope for fun socializing, but also creative cultural content production.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks for that, Sarah. And as always, Michelangelo, that was an extraordinary 2 hours. We could go on for another 2 hours. It's just, I just feel that we have such a way of, the three of us, of just spinning ideas out. It's simply wonderful. And I hope everybody that was listening in and watching as well enjoyed our chats as well, and everything else as well. And thanks for the involvement as well in the chat room as well. Some very, very interesting comments there. Check them out. It's very, very good. This will be uploaded onto my YouTube channel for permanent viewing, probably tomorrow sometime. So check it out and share it and let people know about this. We're building quite a little underground here, but effectively I think that we are creating something that's extraordinary and important and much needed. So thanks again to the Ungoogleable Michelangelo, and as always, thank you very much, Sarah, for spending time with us as well, and everybody else, thanks for listening.